Someone was about to receive a new heart. But the moment didn't feel like hope. It felt like the quiet edge of losing everything. Down the long corridor of Cone Health, Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital in Greensboro, North Carolina, the night carried a strange kind of stillness. Not the peaceful stillness people talk about when they imagine hospitals at midnight. This one was heavier, the kind that settles over a hallway when everyone inside it knows that something important is hanging in the balance. Nicole stood near the far wall, one hand resting against the cool paint as if the building itself might steady him. He had been standing there long enough that his legs felt stiff, long enough that the same 3 thoughts had circled through his mind so many times they had begun to blur together. Stay strong, don't panic, he's going to make it. But strength has a way of wearing thin when doctors stop speaking in confident sentences. A few hours earlier, Nicole had been sitting beside his younger brother's hospital bed. The room had smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic tubing, the quiet hum of machines filling the spaces between breaths. His brother looked smaller in that bed than Nicole remembered. Smaller than the kid who used to race him across open fields when they were young. Smaller than the man who once teased him for working too much. Now his chest rose slowly beneath the thin hospital blanket, and every movement of air seemed to require more effort than the one before. The doctor had spoken carefully. Doctors always did when the truth was difficult. His heart condition has progressed faster than we hoped, the doctor said, hands folded gently in front of him. At this point, the most effective treatment would be a transplant. Nicole had nodded. He understood the words. He had the kind of education that allowed him to understand complicated explanations. Business deals, investment structures, legal contracts. But the language of hospitals had its own weight. Transplant, waiting list, compatibility, time. Time was the one word that kept echoing in his mind. Because sometimes time was generous, and sometimes time was the one thing a person didn't have. Now, hours later, Nicole stood outside the cardiac wing waiting room, while the hospital moved quietly through another night. A nurse pushed a cart down the hallway. A distant elevator opened and closed with a soft chime. Somewhere behind a door, someone whispered a prayer. Nicole rubbed his hands together slowly. People often assumed men like him were used to control. Control over businesses, control over financial outcomes, control over the direction of their lives. But hospitals had a way of stripping that illusion away. Money could build buildings, it could buy equipment, it could fund research, but it could not force a failing heart to keep beating, and it could not guarantee that somewhere out there, a donor would appear in time. Nicole closed his eyes briefly, just a moment, just long enough to gather himself. When he opened them again, the hallway had changed. A doctor was walking toward him, not rushing. Doctors only rushed when something had already gone terribly wrong. But there was urgency in his steps, a quiet urgency. The doctor stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Nicole," he said gently. Nicole straightened. "Yes." The doctor glanced briefly down the hallway, as if making sure no one else was listening too closely. Then he spoke. "We may have received information about a possible donor heart." For a moment, Nicole didn't move. The sentence hung in the air between them like something fragile. Hope, but not the kind of hope that bursts open with celebration. This kind arrived cautiously, carefully, because everyone in that hallway understood that a donor heart meant something else had happened somewhere else in the world. Another family, another loss, another difficult decision. Nicole took a slow breath. "A match?" he asked. "Possibly," the doctor replied. "The transplant team is reviewing compatibility now." Nicole felt his shoulders loosen slightly, not relief, not yet, but the smallest shift in the weight pressing down on him. "How long before you know?" he asked. The doctor hesitated. "Soon," he said. Then he added something that made Nicole pause. "There's one unusual detail connected to this donor case." Nicole frowned slightly. "Unusual?" The doctor nodded once. "It appears the donor situation is connected to someone who was here in the hospital earlier tonight." Nicole blinked. "What do you mean?" The doctor adjusted the chart in his hands. "I don't want to speak too soon," he said carefully. "The transplant team is confirming everything." Nicole felt a quiet tension return to his chest, connected to someone in the hospital. "Earlier tonight." His mind searched for meaning in the sentence, but the pieces didn't quite fit together yet. Before he could ask another question, the doctor's pager vibrated softly. He glanced down. "I need to check on something," he said. "We'll update you as soon as we know more." Then the doctor turned and walked quickly down the hallway, disappearing through a set of double doors. Nicole remained where he was, still, silent. Hospitals had a strange relationship with time. Minutes could feel like hours, and sometimes a single sentence could stretch across an entire night, connected to someone who was here earlier. Nicole leaned back against the wall again, replaying the doctor's words. Earlier tonight, he thought about the people he had seen in the hospital that evening, the families sitting in waiting rooms, the nurses moving quickly between rooms, the quiet conversations happening in corners where hope and fear shared the same space. And then, for reasons he didn't yet understand, a strange memory crossed his mind. A tired nurse, curly hair pulled loosely back, wrinkled scrubs, a voice that carried humor even when the night felt heavy. Nicole opened his eyes again, but that memory didn't belong to this moment. Not yet, because the truth was, the story didn't begin in this hallway. It began 12 hours earlier, back when the city of Greensboro was settling into midnight, back when one exhausted nurse stepped outside after 16 long hours on her feet and made a mistake so simple, so ordinary, that neither she nor the man waiting in that hallway had any idea how important it would become. A wrong car, an open door, two strangers crossing paths for a moment that seemed almost forgettable. Almost. And maybe you've had a moment like that in your own life. A decision that seemed small at the time. A turn you didn't mean to take. A door you stepped through without thinking, only to realize later that moment changed everything. But to understand how a single mistake could bring two lives together on the same night a heart became available, we need to go back 12 hours, back to a quiet Greensboro, midnight, because that's where this story really begins. And before we continue, there's something worth asking yourself. Have you ever stepped into a moment that felt like a mistake, only to discover later that it was the beginning of something bigger? Here's the strange truth about that night in Greensboro. By sunrise, two lives that should have remained strangers would be permanently connected. And the reason would begin with a simple mistake most people would have laughed off in less than 5 seconds. A tired nurse, the wrong car door, and a man sitting inside who had just been told his brother might not survive the week. Not the kind of moment people mark on calendars or write about in journals. Just one of those quiet little accidents that happen when the human brain is exhausted and the night feels longer than it should. But life has a curious way of hiding its biggest turning points inside the smallest decisions. Because that nurse didn't know the man inside the car, and the man inside the car certainly didn't expect a stranger to climb into the back seat beside him. Two people, two completely different worlds. One raised in a neighborhood where front porches were gathering places and Sunday mornings meant church hats and gospel music drifting through open windows. The other raised in a world of private schools, investment meetings, and quiet homes, where conversations about money carried more weight than conversations about feelings. Most people, if they saw them standing side by side, would probably assume they had nothing in common. That assumption would be wrong, but assumptions are easy. People make them every day. You see someone wearing wrinkled scrubs and think they must be tired, underpaid, just trying to get through another shift. You see someone step out of a sleek black car and think they must live a life where problems disappear with the swipe of a credit card. We build entire stories about strangers in seconds. Sometimes those stories are fair. Other times, they miss the truth completely, because the truth about that night wasn't simple. The truth was that one exhausted nurse and one worried brother were about to discover something unexpected about each other, and it would start with a moment that looked like a mistake. But before that moment happened, before the car door opened, before two strangers sat across from each other in confused silence, there was a long shift, a very long shift, and a nurse named Tiffany who had spent the entire night carrying other people's worries on her shoulders. So to understand why that wrong car mattered at all, we have to step back into the hospital again, back to the hours before midnight. Back to the moment Tiffany was finishing the kind of shift that makes your legs ache, your mind drift, and your sense of direction just a little less reliable than usual. Because sometimes a mistake doesn't begin with carelessness. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion. And sometimes that exhaustion walks straight into a moment life has been quietly preparing all along. Because before this story continues, there's a quiet question sitting right in the middle of it. A question most people don't ask themselves until life places them in a moment they didn't expect. What if the stranger you meet on an ordinary night isn't ordinary at all? Not someone you planned to meet, not someone you were looking for, just someone who appears in your path at the exact moment you're too tired, too distracted, or too overwhelmed to notice how important the meeting might become. That's where this story begins, not with grand plans, not with dramatic introductions, just two people living very different lives on the same night in Greensboro. One of them had spent 16 straight hours walking hospital hallways, helping patients breathe easier, comforting families who were trying not to cry, carrying the quiet emotional weight that nurses learn to carry whether they want to or not. The other had spent that same night sitting beside a hospital bed, listening to doctors explain that his younger brother's heart might not last much longer. Two different roles, two different lives, but both carrying something heavy. And if you've ever had a day where everything felt like too much, you probably understand that kind of exhaustion, the kind where your shoulders ache, not just from standing all day, but from holding emotions that don't belong to you. The kind where the only thing your mind wants is a quiet ride home and a bed waiting on the other side of the night. That was Tiffany's reality when her shift finally ended. 16 hours, countless patient rooms, dozens of small conversations that meant more to the families than they would ever realize, and one particular moment earlier that evening that had stayed with her long after it happened. A young man in the emergency wing, his voice shaking, his father's life hanging on a transplant that might not come in time. Hospital workers learn something early in their careers, and Tiffany had a feeling that this was one of those stories. It wasn't thinking about chance encounters. It wasn't thinking about billionaires or life-changing moments. It was thinking about sleep, about the soft comfort of her bed, maybe a bowl of cereal. That's all she wanted. Nothing more, nothing dramatic, just home. But here's the thing about life. Sometimes the moments that change everything arrive when you're not paying attention. Not during big celebrations, not during carefully planned events, but in the middle of ordinary exhaustion. A rideshare request, a black car pulling up to the curb, a door opening, and a tired nurse assuming the ride she ordered had arrived. If you've ever been that tired, you already know how easy that mistake can happen. You don't double-check the license plate. You don't question the timing. Because at that moment, your brain is running on the last little bit of energy it has left, and that's exactly what Tiffany did. She opened the door, she stepped inside, and she leaned back in the seat of a car that was far more luxurious than the rides she usually took. But exhaustion can blur a lot of details, which is why she didn't notice something important right away. She wasn't alone in the back seat, not until a calm voice spoke from the other side of the car. Long night? That single sentence would begin a conversation neither of them expected. And before we step into that moment, there's something worth asking yourself. Because every one of us has had a moment where we made a quick decision without thinking twice. A turn down the wrong street, a conversation with a stranger, a small mistake that seemed harmless at the time. So here's the real question sitting quietly inside this story. Was actually the moment your life quietly changed direction? Stay with me, because the next moment in this story is where things take a turn no one expected. But hold on a second. Because if you think this story is simply about a nurse getting into the wrong car, you're missing the real weight of what happened that night. The mistake wasn't the door she opened. The mistake was assuming that moment didn't matter. Life has a quiet habit of disguising turning points as ordinary accidents, and the one that happened in Greensboro that night looked almost laughable at first. A tired nurse stepping into a luxury chauffeur car, a man in the back seat staring at her in complete confusion, and a few seconds of awkward silence that neither of them knew how to explain. For most people, that would have been the entire story. An embarrassed apology, a quick exit, maybe a funny story to tell coworkers the next day. But that's not how this night unfolded. Because the man sitting in that back seat wasn't just any passenger. He had just walked out of the very same hospital Tiffany was leaving. Just hours earlier, he had been sitting beside his younger brother's hospital bed, listening to doctors explain the time was slipping away faster than anyone expected. The doctors had spoken carefully. They always did. But careful words don't make difficult news any easier to carry. His brother needed a transplant. Not eventually. Not sometime down the road. Soon. Very soon. And when you hear a sentence like that, something shifts inside you. People often assume that wealth protects you from moments like that. That money builds a kind of shield around your life. But hospitals don't recognize bank accounts. Illness doesn't check net worth. And fear visits everyone the same way. The man sitting in that car understood that better than anyone that night. He'd spent hours watching machines monitor his brother's heartbeat, hours listening to doctors explain waiting lists and donor availability, hours trying to look strong even though the truth sat heavy in his chest. By the time he finally stepped outside the hospital doors, the night air felt colder than usual. His driver had opened the back door. He had climbed inside, and for the first time all evening, he allowed himself to sit in silence. No doctors, no charts, no conversations about timelines and possibilities. Just a quiet ride through Greensboro while his mind tried to process everything he had just heard. Then something unexpected happened. The door opened again, not slowly, not cautiously. It opened with the casual confidence of someone who believed they were stepping into their own ride home. A woman slid into the back seat. She leaned back against the leather, closed her eyes, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Best ride I ever ordered," she murmured under her breath. The driver looked into the rearview mirror. The man sitting inside blinked once, and for 2 full seconds. Nobody said a word. That silence lasted just long enough for confusion to settle in. long enough for both of them to realize that something was slightly off. Finally, the man spoke. "Long night?" The woman's eyes opened instantly. She turned her head, and the moment their eyes met, the realization hit both of them at the same time. She was not in the car she thought she ordered, and he was definitely not expecting company. Now, most people would panic. Most people would jump out of the car so fast they'd forget to close the door behind them. But Tiffany wasn't most people. Instead, she stared at him for a moment, blinked twice, and said the only sentence that made sense in her exhausted brain. "Oh, you gotta be kidding me." That was the moment everything shifted, because what happened next wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was laughter. The kind of laughter that only happens when two strangers realize they've accidentally stepped into a situation so strange that the only thing left to do is accept it. And what neither of them understood yet was that this awkward little moment inside a quiet car on a Greensboro street was connected to a heart that had just become available, connected to a transplant team working through the night, connected to a decision another family had made just hours earlier, a decision that would give someone else another chance at life. That connection wasn't obvious yet, not to Tiffany, not to the man sitting across from her, but life was already moving pieces into place, and the strange little mistake inside that car was about to become the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could see. Here's something life teaches slowly. Sometimes the moments that change us forever don't arrive with warning. They don't come with music swelling in the background or people announcing that something important is about to happen. Most of the time, they arrive quietly, looking like nothing special at all. A wrong turn, a missed call, a stranger sitting across from you in the back seat of a car you weren't supposed to enter. Moments like that are easy to dismiss, easy to laugh about later, but every once in a while, life hides something meaningful inside those small accidents. That night in Greensboro carried one of those moments. Two people who had never met before sat across from each other in confused silence. The other had just been told that someone he loved might not survive without a miracle. Neither one of them knew that the same hospital hallway connected their stories. Neither one of them knew that somewhere in that building, doctors were already moving quickly after receiving word that a donor heart might exist. And neither one of them understood, yet, that a simple conversation between strangers was about to bring something unexpected into both of their lives. Not because either of them planned it, not because either of them went looking for it, but because sometimes the road you didn't mean to take leads exactly where you needed to go. The nurse sitting in that car had no idea she would walk back into the hospital the next morning and see the same man again. She didn't know she would eventually stand in the hallway outside his brother's room. She didn't know that the story unfolding inside those hospital walls would slowly connect the two of them in ways neither could have predicted. At that moment, she was just tired. Tired enough to laugh at her own mistake. Tired enough to forget that sometimes the smallest decisions carry the biggest consequences. And the man sitting across from her, he was holding on to hope by the thinnest thread imaginable, waiting for news that could change everything, waiting for a heart, waiting for time to be kind. But life was already moving quietly around them, setting the stage for a connection neither of them could see yet, because what started as a mistake was about to become the moment their stories collided. And sometimes, when two lives cross paths in the middle of an ordinary night, it isn't random at all. Sometimes it's the beginning of something bigger than either person expected. Sometimes it's the moment everything begins to change. Now, before we step fully into the night where this story truly begins, take a moment and settle into the quiet weight of what we just witnessed. Because somewhere inside a hospital in Greensboro, a man was waiting for news that could change his brother's life forever. And somewhere just outside those hospital doors, a tired nurse was about to make a small mistake that would place her directly into that story. Not because she was searching for it, not because she planned it, but because life sometimes places people in the same moment for reasons we only understand later. Moments like that remind us of something important. Every person we pass in life is carrying a story we can't see. Some are holding joy, some are carrying pain, some are standing at the edge of decisions that will shape everything that comes next. And every once in a while, two of those stories cross paths in a way that feels almost too precise to be random. That night in Greensboro was one of those moments. But before we continue, let me say this. Welcome back to Mr. Dave's Stories, where every story reminds us that growth is possible, healing is real, and lessons are everywhere. If this is your first time here, we're honored to have you. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that might uplift, inspire, or change the way you see life. And if stories about unexpected connections, second chances, and the quiet ways life brings people together mean something to you, take a second to show a little support. Tap the like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates a reminder that even ordinary moments can hold extraordinary meaning. And if you've ever had a strange coincidence in your own life that later made perfect sense, tell us about it in the comments. because sometimes the best conversations happen right there between people who realize they've walked through similar moments. Now, let's go back to Greensboro, back to the quiet midnight air outside the hospital, back to the moment when a nurse named Tiffany finished a 16-hour shift and stepped outside looking for the ride that would take her home. She thought the night was finally over. She thought all that waited for her was sleep, but the car pulling toward the curb was about to change that plan completely. Because sometimes, the ride you step into by accident is the one that carries you into the story you were meant to live. Greensboro, North Carolina had a gentle kind of midnight. Not loud, not restless, just quiet streets stretching under warm streetlights, a few late cars rolling past gas stations still open, and the distant hum of the city settling down for the night. Hospitals never really sleep. They pause, they breathe, they continue. And on the cardiac floor that night, Tiffany had been moving through hallways for nearly 16 straight hours. Her sneakers had reached a stage where every step produced a soft squeak against the polished hospital floor. Her scrubs had lost the battle with neatness sometime around hour 10. And the puff of curls she tied together before her shift had slowly loosened until it looked less like a hairstyle and more like survival. But if you asked the nurses who worked beside her, they would all say the same thing about Tiffany. She carried people. Not just physically, though that was part of the job. She carried their fears, their worries, their quiet moments when families needed someone steady to stand beside them. And that strength didn't come from a textbook. It came from the east side of Greensboro. Tiffany grew up in the kind of neighborhood where front porches mattered, where people didn't just live next to each other, they knew each other. Summer evenings meant someone grilling something that smelled good 2 houses away, music drifting through open windows, kids riding bicycles long after the streetlights flickered on, and if someone in the neighborhood fell on hard times, somebody else always showed up with food. That was the rhythm of the place. Her mother worked hard, 2 jobs most weeks. Her grandmother filled in the rest of the spaces. And if there was one person who shaped Tiffany's understanding of the world more than anyone else, it was that grandmother. A woman who believed in 3 things more strongly than anything: work hard, treat people right, and trust that life had its own strange way of guiding people where they needed to go. Tiffany heard that sentence so many times growing up that she could almost hear her grandmother's voice repeating it now. But right now, philosophy wasn't what she was thinking about. Right now she was thinking about sitting down. Just once, maybe for 5 minutes, but the hospital had other plans. "Miss Nurse?" The voice came from room 412. Tiffany stepped inside and found an elderly man adjusting his blankets with slow determination. "Yes, sir," she said gently. The man studied her face carefully. Tiffany blinked. "Pancakes?" "Yes, ma'am." He nodded very seriously. "I figure if this heart decides to quit on me tonight, my last meal ought to be pancakes." For 2 seconds, Tiffany stared at him. Then laughter escaped her before she could stop it. "Sir," she said, trying to regain composure, "this is a cardiac unit." "Well, that's disappointing." The old man sighed. "You're telling me nobody here thought to keep pancakes ready for emergencies?" Tiffany shook her head. "Next time we schedule a medical crisis, I'll make sure the kitchen knows." The man chuckled. Moments like that were small, but they mattered, because humor had a way of making heavy places feel lighter, and hospitals needed that. But tonight hadn't been entirely light. Earlier in the evening, something had happened in the emergency wing that Tiffany couldn't shake from her mind. A young man had come in with his father. The father had been struggling to breathe. Machines moved quickly, doctors worked fast, and the young man stood beside the bed with fear written all across his face. "Please," he said quietly, "you have to help him." Tiffany had placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We're doing everything we can." It was the sentence nurses said when hope still existed but certainty didn't. Later she learned the truth. The father's heart was failing. Without a transplant, time was limited. Tiffany had seen that situation before, too many times. Some families waited weeks, some waited months, some never received the call they hoped for. Hospital workers learned to carry those stories carefully, not because they wanted to, because they had to. If you allowed every story to stay too close to your heart, the job would become impossible. But every once in a while, one of them stayed with you anyway. And tonight felt like one of those nights. By the time the wall clock crept past midnight, Tiffany finally finished her shift notes. Her shoulders sagged with relief. "Lord," she murmured quietly. "I made it." She walked through the hospital doors and stepped into the cool night air. The parking lot was mostly empty now. A few nurses walked toward their cars. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across Greensboro. Tiffany stretched her arms slowly. Her back cracked in protest. "That's not a good sign," she muttered. Her car had been acting up all week, a strange knocking sound that came and went like it had a personality of its own. So tonight she decided not to risk it. She pulled out her phone and opened her rideshare app. The screen glowed softly in the darkness. Request ride. She tapped the button. Estimated arrival, 3 minutes. Thank you, she whispered to no one in particular, because right now the idea of someone else driving her home felt like the greatest luxury in the world. All she wanted was a quiet ride, a bowl of cereal, and the kind of sleep that erased an entire day. She leaned against the curb and waited. The night air felt cool against her tired face. Her mind drifted, back to the young man and his father, back to the endless rhythm of hospital life that never really stopped moving. Then headlights turned the corner. A sleek black car rolled slowly toward the curb. Actually, 2 of them. Tiffany straightened slightly. 2 identical black chauffeur cars approached the hospital entrance almost at the same time. Both polished, both quiet. Tiffany frowned at her phone. Her ride was supposed to be here. The first car slowed. The second car pulled in behind it. For a moment she hesitated. Exhaustion makes small decisions feel harder than they should. She glanced at the app again. Driver arriving. She looked up. The back door of the first car clicked open. Tiffany didn't think twice. She walked over, slid into the seat, and leaned back with the deep sigh of someone who had finally reached the end of a long day. Best ride I ever ordered, she murmured. But something about the car felt different. Too quiet, too polished, too expensive. And just as her brain began to notice that detail, a calm voice spoke from the other side of the back seat. Long night. Tiffany's eyes snapped open. Slowly, she turned her head, and sitting across from her in the dim light of that luxurious car was a well-dressed man she had never seen before. For 2 full seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Tiffany said the only thing her tired brain could produce, "Oh, you got to be kidding me." For a moment, nobody moved. Tiffany sat frozen in the back seat of a car she now realized very clearly did not belong to the rideshare app she had just opened. Across from her, the man in the opposite corner studied her with quiet curiosity. Not alarm, not anger, just the calm expression of someone trying to understand how a stranger had casually appeared in his private car at 12:30 in the morning. The driver in the front seat glanced at the rearview mirror, then quickly looked back at the road as if pretending he hadn't noticed anything unusual. Tiffany blinked once, then twice. Her brain was trying to catch up with the situation. She looked at the leather seats, the polished interior, the small glowing lights along the door panel. Then she looked back at the man. "Well," she said slowly, "this is not my ride." The man tilted his head slightly. "That seems to be the case." Tiffany pressed her fingers against her forehead. "Oh, Lord. Sir, is this a ride share?" The driver cleared his throat politely. "No, ma'am." Tiffany closed her eyes for 1 full second. When she opened them again, she let out a long breath. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's just acknowledge that I have made a very impressive mistake." The man across from her chuckled. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one. Warm and unexpected. "I've had stranger things happen," he said. Tiffany stared at him. "You have? Once a man tried to sell me a boat in the middle of a grocery store." She blinked. "That actually sounds less strange than this." The man smiled faintly. For the first time, Tiffany studied him carefully. He looked to be in his late 30s, well-dressed even though his jacket now rested beside him instead of on his shoulders. His shirt sleeves were rolled slightly, the way people roll them when they've been sitting in uncomfortable chairs too long. But the thing that caught Tiffany's attention wasn't the clothing. It was his eyes. They carried the quiet heaviness she had seen many times before, the look of someone who had spent hours inside a hospital room. Tiffany leaned back slowly. "Let me guess," she said. "You were just at the hospital." The man raised an eyebrow. "That obvious? You got the same look every family member gets after a long night in those chairs." The driver in the front seat nodded slightly as if confirming the observation. The man across from her gave a small smile. "Your powers of observation are impressive." "Nurse training," Tiffany replied. That answer seemed to surprise him. "A nurse?" She gestured down at her scrubs. "These fashion statements aren't exactly subtle." He looked at the wrinkled fabric and laughed softly. "Fair point." Tiffany shifted slightly in the seat. "All right," she said. "Let's restart this conversation properly." She extended her hand. "I'm Tiffany, the exhausted nurse who accidentally broke into your car." The man shook her hand. "Nicole." She blinked. "Nicole?" "Yes." Tiffany glanced between him and the driver. "Well, Nicole, this is a very nice car to accidentally climb into." He shrugged slightly. "I suppose it is." She leaned back again and folded her arms. "So be honest with me. About what? You rich?" Nicole laughed quietly. "That's a direct question. 16-hour hospital shift," she said. "I don't have energy for subtlety," then nodded. "I've done well. That means yes." He didn't deny it. Tiffany looked around the interior again. "Mood lighting," she said. Nicole looked confused. What about it? Mood lighting in a car means you've crossed into a different tax bracket than me. The driver chuckled under his breath. Nicole shook his head. You're very comfortable speaking your mind. My grandmother raised me that way. And what did she teach you? Tiffany smiled slightly. That if you're tired enough, honesty becomes very easy. Nicole leaned back. I can see that. For a moment the car remained parked outside the hospital. The quiet night wrapped around them. Then Nicole asked gently, Long shift? Tiffany nodded. 16 hours. That's a long time. You should try it sometime. I don't think I'd survive. She shrugged. Most people wouldn't. He studied her again. You must care about the work. Tiffany looked out the window toward the hospital entrance. Yeah, she said softly. I do. After a moment she added, Some nights remind you why, and tonight reminded me how fragile things can get. Nicole nodded slowly. My brother is upstairs. Tiffany turned back toward him. Cardiac unit? Yes. Heart condition? Yes. Her nurse instincts had guessed correctly. Nicole continued quietly. The doctors told us he may need a transplant. Tiffany's expression softened immediately. That's a difficult conversation to hear. You've heard it before. Too many times. He nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tiffany tilted her head slightly. You stayed with him all night? Yes, that matters, she said. Nicole looked curious. What do you mean? In hospitals, you notice who stays. Nicole looked down briefly. I'm not going anywhere. Tiffany nodded with quiet approval. Well, she said after a moment, that's good. He glanced at her. You say that like it's rare. Sometimes it is. Nicole looked toward the hospital building again. The lights glowed softly in the distance. Then Tiffany suddenly laughed. Nicole raised an eyebrow. What's funny? She shook her head. I just realized something. What? If my grandmother could see me right now. Nicole waited. She'd say I officially lost my mind. Why? Because I climbed into a stranger's luxury car after midnight. Nicole smiled. She sounds strict. Oh, she was... What else did she say? Tiffany leaned back thoughtfully. She believed life had a strange way of putting people where they needed to be. Nicole looked out the window. The sentence lingered for a moment. Then the driver spoke gently from the front seat. Sir, should we continue driving? Where are you headed? She hesitated, then gave him the name of her neighborhood. Nicole nodded to the driver. Take her home. Tiffany blinked. Wait, what? It's late, he said calmly, and you've clearly had a long shift. She crossed her arms. You do this often? Give rides to nurses who invade your car? First time. Well, congratulations, she said. You're expanding your life experience. Nicole laughed. The car began to move. Streetlights slid across the windows as they drove through Greensboro's quiet streets. Tiffany looked out at the passing houses. Children's bicycles leaned near driveways. Wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze, the kind of neighborhood where people still waved to each other. Right here, she said finally, pointing toward a yellow house on the corner. The car slowed to a stop. She opened the door, then paused and leaned back inside. Hey, Nicole. Yes? Thanks for not calling the police. He smiled. I considered it, she gasped. I knew it, but I decided to let the nurse go free this time. She laughed. Good choice. She stepped out and closed the door, then leaned back toward the window one last time. If your brother needs someone to annoy him while he's stuck in the hospital. Nicole raised an eyebrow. Nicole laughed again. I'll keep that in mind. She waved. Good night, Nicole. Good night, Tiffany. The car pulled away slowly. Nicole watched her walk toward the house. Life has a funny way of putting people exactly where they need to be. But here's the question that lingers at the edge of this moment. If you accidentally stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time, would you rush away from it as quickly as possible? Or would you stay long enough to discover that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the wrong place at all? Morning in Greensboro doesn't arrive all at once. It eases in, slowly. First, the pale light stretches across rooftops. Then the quiet streets begin to stir, the sound of a distant garbage truck, a dog barking 2 houses down, the faint smell of coffee drifting through open kitchen windows. Inside Cone Health Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital, the morning carried a different rhythm. Night nurses were finishing their final rounds. Day nurses were arriving with fresh energy, fresh charts, and the quiet understanding that whatever had happened overnight would now become part of their responsibility. Hospitals live in that space between exhaustion and hope, and at 7:28 a.m., Tiffany walked through the sliding doors again. She carried a cup of coffee in one hand and her bag slung over her shoulder. Most people who had worked a 16-hour shift the night before would have taken the morning off. Tiffany had considered it, for about 5 seconds, but nurses develop a strange relationship with responsibility. When you know patients are depending on you, Staying home starts to feel harder than showing up. So here she was again, back inside the same building she had left only a few hours earlier. Her steps moved automatically down the hallway, past the reception desk, past the elevators. That sight always did something to her, because waiting rooms told stories without saying a single word. She took a slow sip of coffee, then headed toward the cardiac floor. The early shift always had a particular feeling to it, calm but alert, like the hospital was taking a deep breath before the day truly began. A nurse passing by gave her a quick nod. "Morning, Tiffany, morning." Another nurse rolled a cart down the hall. Machines beeped softly from patient rooms. She walked toward the patient, chartboard, room numbers, conditions, medication notes. Then one name made her pause. She didn't know the patient personally yet, but she recognized the family contact listed beside it. Nicole. Tiffany leaned back slightly. "Well," she murmured under her breath. Her grandmother's voice drifted through her memory. "Life has a strange way of putting people where they need to be." She looked again at the room number, 418. Her coffee suddenly felt warmer in her hands. For a second she debated whether to go there. Technically she wasn't assigned to that room. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and something about the quiet conversation inside that car last night had stayed with her longer than she expected. She set her empty cup in a nearby bin, then walked down the hallway. Room 418 waited near the end of the corridor. The door was slightly open. Morning sunlight slipped through the blinds, laying soft stripes across the hospital floor. Tiffany knocked gently on the doorframe. "Morning," she said. Inside the room, Nicole looked up. For a moment he simply stared, as if his brain needed an extra second to process what he was seeing. Then a tired smile appeared on his face. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess your grandmother was right." Tiffany leaned against the doorframe. "About what?" "Life putting people where they need to be." She stepped inside. "Either that, or Greensboro is a very small city." Nicole gave a quiet laugh. His shirt was slightly wrinkled. His eyes carried the dull heaviness of someone who hadn't slept. She glanced toward the hospital bed. Nicole's brother lay resting beneath the blankets, machines quietly monitoring the rhythm of his heart. The steady beeping filled the room. Tiffany walked over and checked the chart. Her nurse instincts moved automatically. Heart rate, oxygen levels, medication schedule. Everything seemed stable, at least for now. Nicole watched her carefully. "You're not assigned to this room, are you?" he asked. Tiffany shook her head. "Nope." "Then why are you here?" She shrugged lightly. "Curiosity." Nicole smiled. "That's honest. Always easier in the morning." She finished adjusting a small setting on one of the monitors and stepped back. "How's he doing today?" Nicole looked at his brother for a moment before answering. "The doctors say he's stable, but," Tiffany asked gently. Nicole exhaled slowly. "But stable doesn't mean safe." That sentence carried a weight Tiffany knew very well. She pulled a chair closer and sat down beside the bed. "You stayed all night," she said quietly. Nicole nodded. "I tried to sleep for a while, and—" The hospital chair disagreed. Tiffany smiled faintly. "Those chairs are designed by people who hate backs." Nicole laughed softly. For a moment the room felt lighter, but the tension beneath the surface never disappeared completely. Nicole leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know something strange," he said. "What?" "Last night when you climbed into that car," he paused. "It was the first time I laughed all day." Tiffany looked surprised. "That bad, huh?" He nodded. The doctors had just finished explaining the transplant list. She grew quiet. "How long is the wait?" Nicole rubbed his hands together. "They said it depends. That usually means a long time." "Yes." The room fell silent for a moment. Tiffany studied Nicole carefully. Not his clothes, not the expensive watch on his wrist, but the way he looked at the bed. People reveal themselves most clearly when someone they love is lying in a hospital room. And Nicole wasn't pretending to be strong. He was simply staying. That mattered. After a moment she spoke again. "You know, families show up in different ways." Nicole glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "In hospitals you notice patterns." She gestured toward the chair beside him. "Some people sit where you're sitting, and others, they disappear." Nicole didn't answer immediately. He just looked at his brother. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. Tiffany nodded. "I can see that." Another small silence filled the room. Then the door opened. A doctor stepped inside carrying a chart. "Good morning," he said. Nicole stood immediately. "Morning, doctor." The doctor nodded politely to Tiffany, then turned back to Nicole. "We've been reviewing the transplant list again." Nicole's shoulders stiffened slightly. And the doctor adjusted his glasses. There are a few complications we need to discuss. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nicole spoke carefully. What kind of complications? The doctor looked down at the chart before answering. Availability, compatibility, and timing. 3 words, each one heavier than the last. Nicole swallowed. Are you saying he might not get a heart in time? The doctor didn't answer right away. And that silence said more than words ever could. Tiffany felt the tension in the room settle deeper. Because in hospitals, hope and fear often sit in the same chair. And sometimes, they wait together longer than anyone expects. Late morning settled gently over the cardiac floor. By then, the hospital had fully awakened. Footsteps moved steadily through the hallways. Carts rolled past with quiet purpose, and the air carried that familiar blend of coffee, disinfectant, and the soft mechanical rhythm of machines doing their work. Inside room 418, the world felt slower. Nicole sat in the chair beside the bed, one hand loosely folded over the other. The doctor had already left, but his words still lingered in the room like a cloud that hadn't quite moved on. Availability, compatibility, timing, 3 words that could stretch a person's patience thinner than they thought possible. Nicole stared at the heart monitor beside the bed. Beep, pause, beep. Every sound felt like a reminder that time was moving forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. Across the room, Tiffany adjusted the blinds slightly so the sunlight softened instead of glaring directly across the bed. Nicole watched her for a moment before speaking. You make that look easy. Tiffany glanced back at him. Make what look easy? This. He gestured around the room. The hospital, the pressure, people depending on you. She leaned lightly against the windowsill and crossed her arms. It's not easy. Nicole tilted his head. But you make it look that way. Tiffany gave a small half smile. That's because patients don't need to see the stress. They've got enough of their own. Nicole nodded slowly. That answer made sense. But it also revealed something about her that he hadn't fully noticed the night before. Strength. Not loud strength. Not the kind people announce. The quiet kind that shows up every day and does the work. After a moment, Tiffany walked over and sat in the empty chair across from him. You didn't go home, she said. Nicole shook his head. No, not even for a few hours. I thought about it, and... He looked at his brother. I didn't want him waking up alone. That sentence hung in the room for a moment. Tiffany studied him quietly. Then she nodded once, slowly. Your brother's lucky. Nicole raised an eyebrow. Because it's true. He looked down at his hands. In my world, people are around all the time. Business partners? Yes. Employees? Yes. Advisors? Yes. Tiffany tilted her head. But when things get hard... Nicole didn't answer immediately. After a moment, he sighed. That list gets shorter. She nodded again. That's how life works. Nicole leaned back slightly in his chair. You know, when I was growing up, people told me money solved problems. Tiffany smiled faintly. Let me guess. What? It solved some of them, yes, and created a few new ones. Nicole laughed quietly. That's accurate. For a moment they both sat there, the quiet of the hospital room wrapping around the conversation. Then Tiffany asked something simple. Where did you grow up? Nicole leaned his head back slightly, thinking. Mostly outside the city, large house, long driveway, the kind of place where neighbors are a mile away. Tiffany chuckled. That's already different from where I grew up. Oh, east side of Greensboro. Nicole nodded with curiosity. What was that like? Tiffany leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. Nicole laughed. None? None. She smiled as the memories came back. You could walk outside and somebody 3 houses down already knew where you were going. Sounds intense. It was community. She pointed toward the hallway. If somebody got sick, food started showing up before the ambulance even left the driveway. Nicole listened carefully. And family gatherings? He asked. Oh, those were something else. How so? Picture 10 people bringing dishes nobody asked for. Nicole laughed. And everybody eating anyway. Exactly. She paused, her voice softening slightly. My grandmother used to host cookouts after church. Nicole leaned forward, interested. What kind of cookouts? The loud kind, Tiffany said with a grin. Music playing, kids running everywhere, somebody arguing about who burned the ribs. Nicole shook his head. That sounds alive. It was. She looked at him carefully. What about you? Nicole shrugged slightly. Our gatherings were different. How different? Long tables, quiet conversations, people discussing business even during dinner, no music, sometimes no cousins chasing each other around the yard. Nicole smiled. Not usually. Tiffany shook her head with mock disappointment. You missed out. Maybe I did. For a moment they both sat quietly. The contrast between their childhoods hung gently in the air. Two very different versions of American life. But somehow the conversation didn't feel awkward. It felt honest. Nicole looked around the room. You know what surprises me? What? You don't seem impressed by money. Tiffany blinked. Should I be? Most people are. She leaned back in her chair. Money's useful. Nicole waited. But it doesn't change what matters most, and what's that? She looked toward the hospital bed. People. Nicole followed her gaze. My grandmother used to say something. Tiffany continued quietly. What did she say? That money fixes problems. She paused. But it doesn't fix fear. Nicole looked at her again. The sentence landed deeper than he expected. Because sitting in that hospital room, watching the slow rhythm of the heart monitor beside his brother's bed, he knew exactly what she meant. Money had built companies. Money had built hospitals. But it couldn't promise him that the person lying in that bed would survive, and that truth felt heavier than anything he had faced in business. Nicole rubbed the back of his neck. You're right. Tiffany tilted her head slightly. About what? Money doesn't fix fear. The room fell quiet again. Then the door opened. Nicole stood immediately. The doctor gave a polite nod to Tiffany before turning his attention back to Nicole. I wanted to give you an update. Nicole's chest tightened slightly. Yes? The doctor spoke carefully. We're continuing to review transplant options. Nicole nodded slowly. And your brother's condition is becoming more fragile. The words settled heavily in the room. Nicole's voice dropped lower. How much time do we have? The doctor hesitated. Not long enough to avoid the truth, but long enough for the weight of it to be understood. We're doing everything we can, he said. Then he added something that made Tiffany glance up sharply. He paused. Time is becoming our biggest challenge. Afternoon slowly folded into evening inside the hospital. Hours passed in the quiet way hospital hours often do, without announcement, without ceremony, just the steady movement of time across the clock on the wall. Inside room 418, the light had shifted from bright morning sunlight to the softer glow of early evening. Nicole had barely moved. The same chair, the same position, one elbow resting on his knee, fingers loosely folded together as his eyes drifted back and forth between his brother and the heart monitor. Beep, pause, beep. The sound had become part of the room now, part of the silence. Tiffany stepped into the hallway just outside the room, holding a clipboard she had already read twice. Sometimes nurses checked charts not because they needed the information, but because it gave their hands something to do while their minds sorted through heavier thoughts. The doctor's words from earlier that day still lingered in her mind. Time is becoming our biggest challenge. She had heard sentences like that before. In hospitals, hope and urgency often lived in the same room, and waiting was its own kind of emotional weight. She glanced through the open doorway. Nicole was still there, still watching, still sitting exactly where he had been hours earlier. Tiffany sighed quietly. Then she walked inside. You know, she said gently, that chair hasn't gotten any more comfortable since this morning. Nicole looked up. A tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. I was hoping it might soften up eventually. Not a chance. She set the clipboard down and checked the monitor beside the bed. Everything looked stable for now. That word again, stable. Hospitals used it often. Sometimes it meant good news. Sometimes it meant the storm hadn't arrived yet. Tiffany turned back toward him. Have you eaten anything today? Nicole blinked slightly, as if the question surprised him. I had coffee. That doesn't count. It does in certain business circles. Well, it doesn't count here. Nicole chuckled softly. Tiffany studied him carefully. You've been here all day. Yes. And all night before that. Yes. She crossed her arms. Nicole, even people sitting beside hospital beds need to take care of themselves. He looked toward the floor for a moment. I know, but leaving feels wrong. Tiffany nodded slowly. That answer made sense, more than he probably realized. She had seen it before. Family members sitting through long nights because stepping away, even for an hour, felt like abandoning someone who needed them. After a moment, she walked over to the small counter near the wall. A paper coffee cup sat there beside a half-empty water bottle. Tiffany picked up the cup. Cold, completely forgotten. She shook her head slightly. You're going to fall asleep standing up at this rate. Nicole leaned back in the chair. I doubt it. Why? Because every time I close my eyes, I think about the transplant list. Tiffany paused. That sentence carried the quiet weight of a man trying not to imagine the worst. She leaned against the counter. Waiting is the hardest part. Nicole looked up. You say that like you've watched it happen before. I have. Many times? She nodded once. Families come in thinking the hardest moment will be the diagnosis, but the waiting stretches people in ways they didn't expect. Nicole glanced back at the bed. And sometimes the call never comes. Tiffany didn't answer right away, because the truth sat quietly between them, and sometimes silence is the most honest response. Finally, she said softly, "Sometimes it does." Nicole looked up again. He studied her face for a moment. "You really believe that I have to—" "Why?" "Because I've seen it happen." Her voice carried a calm certainty that felt steady, like a hand placed gently on someone's shoulder. Nicole exhaled slowly. Then he stood up and walked toward the window. City lights were beginning to flicker on in the distance. "I built hospitals," he said quietly. Tiffany blinked. "What?" Nicole turned slightly. "My company's funded 3 hospital wings across the state." Tiffany leaned forward with curiosity. "I didn't know that. Most people don't. Why keep it quiet?" Nicole shrugged. It always felt strange announcing things like that. He rested his hands on the windowsill. "We built research centers, donation programs, charity foundations. That sounds like a lot of good work. It is. But—" Nicole's shoulders dropped slightly. "But right now, none of that feels like enough." Tiffany watched him carefully. "I spent years believing I could solve problems if I worked hard enough," he continued. She nodded slowly. "That's a common belief. Not in hospitals, no." Nicole looked back toward the bed. "You can build the building." He paused. "But you can't build time." Tiffany felt that sentence settle deep in the room. Because he was right. Hospitals were places where even the most powerful people faced the same truth everyone else did. Life had limits, and time didn't negotiate. She walked over and handed him a fresh cup of coffee she had quietly prepared at the hallway machine. "Here," she said. Nicole looked surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He accepted the cup. The warmth of it rested between his hands for a moment before he spoke again. "Thank you." They stood there quietly for a few seconds, just 2 people sharing a small pause inside a long day. Then footsteps approached the doorway. A hospital staff member appeared holding a tablet. "I'm looking for the family contact for the patient in this room," they said. Nicole stepped forward. "That's me." The staff member nodded. "The transplant coordination team asked me to relay a message." Nicole's grip tightened slightly around the coffee cup. "What message?" The staff member glanced at the screen. "There may be a possible donor match under review." The room grew very still. Tiffany's eyes lifted toward Nicole. He didn't speak right away, because hope, real hope, has a way of arriving quietly, carefully. The staff member continued. "It's rare, but the compatibility indicators look promising." Nicole finally found his voice. "How long before they know for sure? Tests are being confirmed now." The staff member gave a polite nod before stepping back into the hallway. And just like that, the waiting had changed, not finished, not resolved, but shifted. Because somewhere in the hospital, doctors were now reviewing a possibility that hadn't existed an hour earlier. A rare match. And for the first time all day, hope felt just a little bit closer. Night had settled again over Greensboro. Inside room 418, the hallway outside had grown quieter than it had been all day. Nurses moved with softer footsteps now, voices lowered, the kind of calm that comes when a hospital begins easing into its overnight rhythm. Tiffany stood near the window for a moment, watching the dim lights of the city beyond the glass. Greensboro at night always had a certain stillness to it, not empty, just thoughtful. Nicole sat in the same chair beside the bed, his posture leaning slightly forward, his attention still fixed on his brother. The possibility of a donor match had changed something inside the room, not relief exactly, but a different kind of waiting. Hope had entered the space, and hope, when it arrives in a hospital, has a strange weight to it. Nicole finally looked up. "You've been quiet for a few minutes." Tiffany turned back from the window. "Sorry," she said softly. "Sometimes my mind wanders when the floor gets this quiet." Nicole nodded. "I understand that." She stepped closer to the bed and glanced briefly at the monitor. Everything's still steady, still stable. For now. Nicole studied her for a moment. "You said something earlier today," he said. Tiffany looked up. "What was that?" "About your grandmother." A small smile touched Tiffany's face. "She said a lot of things. I get the feeling she shaped who you are." Tiffany let out a soft breath. "That would be accurate." Nicole leaned back slightly in his chair. "What was she like?" For a moment, Tiffany didn't answer. Her eyes drifted toward the floor as if the question had opened a door she hadn't walked through in a while. Then she spoke. My grandmother believed people should take care of each other. Nicole waited quietly. She used to say that a neighborhood only stays strong when people treat each other like family, even when they aren't. Her voice carried a gentle rhythm now, shaped by memory. I grew up on the east side of Greensboro, she continued, the kind of place where front porches were basically living rooms. Nicole smiled faintly. Meaning? Meaning everybody sat outside in the evenings, kids riding bikes up and down the street, someone grilling chicken 2 houses over, music floating through open windows, and if somebody needed help. She paused slightly. Help usually arrived before anyone had to ask. Nicole listened carefully. His own childhood had been very different. Quiet neighborhoods, large houses, long driveways where neighbors waved politely but rarely stepped inside each other's lives. Tiffany continued. My grandmother knew everybody. That sounds exhausting. Tiffany laughed softly. It probably was. She leaned lightly against the counter near the wall. But she loved it. Nicole tilted his head. What kind of things would she do? Tiffany smiled again. If someone down the street got sick, she'd cook food and send me walking over there with it. Nicole nodded. Even if you didn't know them well? Especially if we didn't know them well. Why especially? Because she believed kindness mattered most when people weren't expecting it. Nicole looked down at his hands for a moment. That sentence settled somewhere deeper than he expected. Tiffany's voice softened slightly as the memories continued. She worked hard too, always had. What did she do? Whatever the family needed. Nicole chuckled quietly. That's not very specific. That's because it changed every few years. She counted lightly on her fingers. She cleaned houses for a while, worked in a school cafeteria, helped at a church office. Nicole raised an eyebrow. She sounds like someone who didn't sit still, not for long. Tiffany's smile faded slightly, but the one place she spent the most time was hospitals. Nicole looked up again. Hospitals? Yes. She worked there? No. Tiffany paused. Then she spoke more quietly. She volunteered. Nicole waited. She said hospitals were the place where people needed kindness the most. The room fell silent for a moment, because that sentence carried more meaning than the simple words suggested. Nicole finally asked, Is that why you became a nurse? Tiffany's expression shifted. Something thoughtful, something deeper. Partly, she said. Nicole noticed the hesitation. Partly. She nodded slowly. There was another reason. Nicole didn't interrupt. Sometimes the most important stories take a moment to find their way out. Tiffany looked toward the bed, then back at Nicole. I was 12 when I first spent a real night in a hospital. Nicole straightened slightly. You were sick? No. She took a slow breath. My mother was... Nicole felt the room grow heavier. Tiffany continued quietly. She collapsed at work one afternoon. The memory flickered across her face like a shadow. Next thing I knew, we were in a hospital room. Nicole listened carefully. Doctors moving quickly, machines making noises I didn't understand. She shook her head slightly. At 12 years old, hospitals feel enormous. Nicole could imagine it. The bright lights, the unfamiliar sounds, the fear of not knowing what was happening. My grandmother stayed with me the whole time, Tiffany said. She held my hand the entire night. Nicole asked gently, Was your mother okay? Tiffany nodded. Yes. Relief softened the moment slightly. She recovered, Tiffany said. But that night stayed with me. Nicole leaned forward a little. What do you mean? I remember watching the nurses. She paused. They moved through the room so calmly, even when things looked frightening. Nicole understood that feeling, the quiet strength medical workers carried. At one point, Tiffany continued, one of the nurses knelt down beside me. Nicole waited. She told me something simple. What? That my mother was in good hands. Tiffany's eyes softened, and the way she said it. I believed her. Nicole nodded slowly. That matters. Yes. She looked toward the hallway. That nurse probably forgot that moment 5 minutes later. Nicole tilted his head. But you didn't... No. Tiffany smiled gently. That was the first time I realized what nurses really do. Nicole waited for her to finish. They don't just treat patients, she said. They carry people through the moments when fear feels bigger than hope. The room fell quiet again. Nicole studied her for a long second. You've been carrying people ever since. Tiffany shrugged slightly. I guess so. Then she added softly, My grandmother used to say something else. Nicole smiled. I'm beginning to think she had a lot of wisdom. She did. What was this one? Tiffany's voice grew thoughtful again. She said the way we show up for people, especially when they're hurting, says more about us than anything else we ever do. Nicole looked at his brother again, then back at Tiffany, and for the first time since this long hospital night had begun, he realized something clearly. Tiffany hadn't just chosen a profession, she had chosen a purpose, and sometimes the people who carry the most strength into a hospital room are the ones who learned that strength long before they ever put on a uniform. The next afternoon arrived slowly inside the hospital. Time had taken on that strange elastic feeling again, the kind that stretches and folds depending on what someone is waiting for. Inside room 418, the day had passed quietly. Nicole had stepped out twice, once for a phone call he barely remembered making, and once to walk down the hall simply to remind his legs they still worked. The transplant team had not returned with new answers yet, so waiting continued. Hope was still there, but hope in hospitals rarely sits comfortably. It shifts. It watches the clock. It breathes slowly. Late in the afternoon, Tiffany stepped back into the room carrying 2 paper cups. Nicole looked up from the chair beside the bed. "You're starting to make this a habit," he said. Tiffany handed him one of the cups. "Hospital coffee is terrible," she replied, "but it's better than nothing." Nicole accepted the cup. "That's a convincing argument." They both stood quietly for a moment, the steam rising from the cups between them. Nicole glanced at her. "You've been here most of the day again. That's kind of the job. You've checked on this room more than the others." Tiffany gave a small shrug. "Curiosity." Nicole smiled faintly. "You said that yesterday. Still true." They both sipped their coffee. After a moment, Nicole spoke again. "You mentioned a diner near your neighborhood the other day." Tiffany looked up. "Yeah, is it good?" She raised an eyebrow. "Define good. Good enough to survive hospital food." Tiffany laughed softly. "That's a very low bar." Nicole nodded. "Still counts." She studied him for a moment. "You're serious? I haven't left this building in 2 days. That sounds miserable." Nicole shrugged. "I've had worse weeks." Tiffany tilted her head slightly. "Tell you what," she said. "There's a place a few blocks from my neighborhood." Nicole waited. "They make the kind of food that reminds you people still cook with love. That sounds promising." She nodded. "You could use a real meal." Nicole hesitated for a moment. Then he looked toward the bed. The machines continued their steady rhythm. Beep, pause, beep. He turned back to Tiffany. "An hour? An hour." Nicole nodded slowly. "All right." The diner sat on a corner street where the sidewalks were slightly cracked and the neon sign above the door had probably been glowing there for 20 years. Inside, the air smelled like bacon, coffee, and warm bread. Tiffany pushed the door open. A bell above the frame chimed softly. Nicole stepped inside behind her. Immediately something felt different. Not the polished quiet of expensive restaurants, not the careful distance of places where people kept conversations low and formal. This place felt alive. 2 men at the counter argued playfully about a basketball game on the small television above the wall. A woman near the window waved when she saw Tiffany walk in. "Look who finally decided to show up," she said warmly. Tiffany laughed. "I work at a hospital, remember? That's no excuse to disappear for a week." Nicole noticed something interesting. Every person in the diner seemed to recognize her. Not in the polite way people acknowledge strangers, in the comfortable way people greet someone they trust. The woman behind the counter leaned forward. "You eating today or just visiting?" "Eating," Tiffany replied. "Good. Sit wherever you like." Nicole followed her to a small booth near the window. As they sat down, he glanced around again. "You come here often?" "Since I was a kid." Nicole nodded. "I can tell." A man at the next table looked over. "Tiffany, you still working those crazy hospital hours?" "Always," she replied. "Bless you for that." Nicole watched the exchange quietly. Something about this place felt different from the environments he was used to. No one seemed impressed by money. No one seemed intimidated by status. People simply spoke to each other like neighbors. "What can I get you to?" Tiffany glanced at Nicole. "Trust me," she said. He nodded. "All right." Tiffany turned back to the woman. "2 plates, the usual." The woman smiled. "Coming right up." As she walked away, Nicole leaned back slightly. "You didn't even look at a menu. There isn't one." Nicole chuckled. "That explains things." For a moment they sat quietly. Then Nicole said something thoughtful. "Everyone here seems to know you." Tiffany shrugged. "Neighborhood places are like that." "No, it's more than that." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "They respect you." Tiffany blinked slightly. "That's a strong word." Nicole shook his head gently. "It's accurate." She looked down at the table for a moment. "I've helped a few people around here." "How?" "Sometimes it's medical advice." Nicole nodded. "And sometimes?" "Sometimes it's just listening." Nicole thought about that. Listening. Such a simple thing. Yet so many people rarely did it. The plates arrived a few minutes later. The smell alone made Nicole realize how hungry he actually was. He took one bite, then looked up. You were right. About what? People really do cook with love here. Tiffany smiled. They ate quietly for a few minutes. Then Nicole spoke again. You know something? What? I've spent most of my life measuring success in numbers. Tiffany leaned back slightly. Money? Yes. Companies? Yes. He paused. But sitting here, watching the way people treat you. Tiffany waited. It's making me rethink that definition. She studied him carefully. How so? Nicole gestured lightly toward the diner. These people trust you. They know you care about them. That kind of impact doesn't show up on financial statements. Tiffany smiled gently. My grandmother would agree with that. Nicole nodded. I'm starting to understand why. For the first time in days, Nicole felt something shift inside him. Not the heavy tension of waiting. Something quieter. Something thoughtful. Because sometimes, the most valuable things in life aren't measured by what someone owns. They're measured by how many lives they've quietly helped along the way. Evening settled gently over Greensboro again. By the time Nicole and Tiffany returned to Cone Health Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital, the sky had already turned a deep shade of blue, the last light of the day slipping behind the distant trees that lined the edge of the city. Hospitals always felt different at night. Quieter, not empty, never empty, but softer, voices lowered, footsteps slower. The building itself almost seemed to breathe differently once the sun went down. Nicole and Tiffany walked side by side through the sliding doors. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something about stepping back into the hospital that always reminded Nicole why he had left in the first place. The smell, the quiet tension, the feeling that every hallway held someone waiting for news. Tiffany glanced at him as they approached the elevators. You okay? Nicole nodded slowly. Yeah, but the truth sat just beneath that word. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a soft chime. They stepped inside. The elevator began its slow climb toward the cardiac floor. For a few seconds, the only sound was the gentle hum of the cables above them. Nicole leaned lightly against the wall. That diner helped. Tiffany smiled. Real food has that effect. I forgot what it felt like to eat something that didn't come from a hospital cafeteria. That's a tragedy in itself. Nicole chuckled quietly. The elevator doors opened again. They stepped out onto the floor where room 418 waited at the end of the hallway. But something felt different immediately. A few nurses stood near the desk speaking in low voices. One of them glanced toward Nicole when he stepped into the hall. Tiffany noticed it too. Her nurse instinct sharpened slightly. They walked down the corridor together. Nicole's steps slowed as they approached the room. The door was partially closed. A doctor stood just outside it reviewing a chart. Nicole felt his chest tighten. The doctor looked up. Mr. Nicole. Nicole stepped forward. Yes? The doctor gave a polite nod to Tiffany before continuing. We were hoping to speak with you when you returned. Nicole's stomach sank slightly. That sentence rarely came before easy news. What's going on? He asked. The doctor glanced toward the room. Your brother's condition has changed this afternoon. Nicole's voice lowered. Changed how? The doctor spoke carefully, choosing each word with the precision that hospital conversations required. His heart rhythm has become more unstable. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter. Nicole stared at him. I thought you said he was stable this morning. He was, and now? The doctor hesitated. Now things are becoming more fragile. Nicole felt the weight of those words settle heavily inside his chest. How fragile? The doctor closed the chart slowly. The next 24 hours will be very important. Tiffany stood beside them quietly. She had heard conversations like this before, but hearing them never became easier. Nicole glanced toward the door of room 418. Can I see him? Of course. The doctor stepped aside. Nicole pushed the door open and walked inside. The room looked almost the same as when he had left earlier that afternoon. The same steady lights, the same quiet machines. But Nicole noticed something different immediately. Another monitor had been added beside the bed. More wires, more quiet beeping. Tiffany stepped inside behind him. Nicole moved to the chair beside the bed again. He sat down slowly. His brother's breathing was still steady, but something about the room carried a different tension now. Nicole leaned forward slightly. We just left for an hour, he murmured quietly. Hospitals had a strange way of changing everything in a short amount of time. Tiffany walked to the monitor and studied the numbers. Her expression remained calm, but inside she could see what the doctor meant. The rhythm was less stable than before, not dangerous yet, but unpredictable. She turned toward Nicole. He's still fighting, she said gently. Nicole nodded. I know. He sat there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over his brother's chest. Then he spoke again. Tiffany waited. A week ago, my biggest concern was a business deal falling apart. She leaned lightly against the wall. And now none of that feels important. Tiffany didn't answer right away, because that realization, that shift in priorities, was something hospitals often revealed. Nicole looked up at her. You've been here every day since we met. That's my job, not just the job. Tiffany raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? You could check the chart and move on, but you stay. Tiffany thought about that for a moment. Then she gave a quiet shrug. Sometimes people need someone to sit with them. Nicole nodded slowly. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the hallway continued its slow nighttime rhythm. Not romance. Not yet. Something simpler. Respect. Two people from very different worlds, discovering that the things that mattered most were not so different after all. But the moment didn't last long. A knock sounded gently on the door. Nicole looked up. The doctor stepped inside again. His expression had changed slightly. More serious now. Nicole stood immediately. What is it? We've received new test results. Nicole's chest tightened. And? The doctor looked from Nicole to Tiffany and back again. Then he spoke the sentence neither of them had been ready to hear. Your brother's condition is deteriorating faster than we expected. The room went still. Nicole felt the words land like a weight he couldn't quite carry. How fast? He asked quietly. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Because sometimes the truth inside a hospital room arrives slowly, and sometimes it changes everything. For a moment after the doctor spoke, the room felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Nicole stood beside the bed, his hands resting on the metal rail, his eyes fixed on his brother's face as if watching closely enough might somehow slow time. The doctor's voice remained careful. We're monitoring closely. His heart rhythm is becoming more unstable. If we don't find a compatible, transplant soon. The sentence drifted unfinished. It didn't need to be completed. Everyone in the room already understood. Nicole lowered his head slightly. For a second he said nothing. Then he nodded once, a quiet nod, the kind people give when the truth has arrived whether they are ready for it or not. Tiffany stood near the monitor, watching the steady but uneven rhythm displayed on the screen. Her nurse instincts had already recognized what the doctor meant. The heart was struggling, still fighting, but struggling. Hospitals have a way of compressing emotions into small spaces. Fear, hope, fatigue. All of it lived inside that room. Nicole slowly sat back down in the chair beside the bed. His voice came out softer this time. What happens now? The doctor adjusted the chart in his hands. We continue monitoring. The transplant coordination team is still reviewing potential matches. Nicole nodded again. The doctor placed a steady hand on the bed rail. We are doing everything possible. Then he stepped quietly out of the room. The door closed gently behind him. Silence followed. Nicole leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes stayed fixed on his brother. You hear that? He murmured softly. You're still in this? The monitor answered with another slow rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. Across the room, Tiffany watched him carefully. Some moments required words, others didn't. She stepped forward and adjusted one of the IV lines, giving Nicole a moment alone with his thoughts. Then something changed. A sudden burst of movement in the hallway. Footsteps. Quick ones. Voices speaking faster than the quiet pace the floor had held earlier. Tiffany glanced toward the door. Nicole noticed too. The hallway outside had shifted. The calm rhythm of the evening had been replaced by something else. Urgency. The door opened again. Not gently this time. A hospital staff member stepped inside holding a tablet. Is Mr. Nicole here? Nicole stood immediately. Yes. The staff member looked at him carefully. The transplant coordination team needs you in the consultation room. Nicole blinked. Right now? Yes. The word landed with weight. Nicole glanced toward the bed, then back toward Tiffany. Her eyes had already sharpened with understanding. Something was happening. Go, she said softly. Nicole hesitated. What about? I'll stay here, Tiffany said. You go. He nodded once. Then followed the staff member down the hallway. The corridor outside had transformed. Doctors moving quickly between rooms, nurses speaking in quick bursts of conversation, phones ringing. Tiffany stepped into the hallway just in time to hear someone say the words every transplant floor both hopes for and fears. We may have a donor. The sentence traveled through the corridor like electricity. Nicole stopped walking. Slowly he turned. Did you say donor? The staff member nodded. The transplant team received notification from another hospital unit. Nicole's heart began to pound harder than it had all night. Is it a match? We're still confirming compatibility. The staff member pushed open the door to a small consultation room. Inside, several charts were spread across the table. A doctor looked up as Nicole entered. Mr. Nicole. Nicole stepped inside. Tell me what's happening. The doctor gestured for him to sit. We've received a donor notification. Nicole remained standing. A confirmed donor? Possibly. Nicole's chest tightened. What does that mean? The doctor spoke carefully. There is a donor case within this hospital system tonight. Early compatibility indicators suggest your brother could be a candidate. Nicole felt the word sink slowly into his mind. A candidate? Yes. His voice lowered. Where did the donor come from? The doctor hesitated slightly. There are some details still being verified. Nicole frowned. What kind of details? The doctor looked down at the chart. The donor case originated earlier this evening, from another patient admitted through the emergency department. Nicole said nothing. The doctor continued. The family made a decision very quickly. Nicole leaned forward slightly. What decision? The doctor met his eyes. They chose organ donation. The room grew still, because behind every donor heart, there is always another family grieving. Nicole swallowed slowly. When will you know if it's a match? Very soon. Outside the consultation room, the hospital floor had become a quiet storm of activity. Phones ringing, orders being confirmed, medical teams preparing for a possibility that might change everything. Down the hallway, Tiffany stood outside room 418 watching the movement around her. She had seen nights like this before. The energy of a transplant call was unmistakable. But something about this one felt different. One of the nurses passing by glanced at her. You hear? Tiffany nodded slowly. Yes. They say the donor case came from the emergency unit earlier tonight. Tiffany's mind paused for a moment. Earlier tonight, emergency unit. A memory flickered. A young man, desperate. His father struggling to breathe. Tiffany's eyes lifted slowly. The nurse continued walking down the hallway, but Tiffany remained standing there, very still, because a strange thought had just entered her mind. And sometimes, the moments that connect two stories together arrive without warning. The hospital had changed, not the building itself. The walls were the same, the lights still glowing softly down the corridor, but the energy inside those walls had shifted. Anyone who had worked in a hospital long enough could feel it. A transplant call does that. It moves through the building like a current of electricity. Quiet urgency, focused movement, phones ringing just a little faster, voices lowered, but purposeful. Inside the consultation room, Nicole stood with both hands resting against the edge of the table. He hadn't sat down. He didn't trust his legs to stay still long enough. Across from him, the doctor studied the tablet in his hands. Numbers, blood compatibility indicators, lab results moving quickly through the transplant system. Nicole finally broke the silence. How long until you know for sure? The doctor exhaled slowly. We're confirming the final compatibility test now. Nicole nodded once. And if it's a match, then we move immediately. Nicole looked down at the table, his reflection faintly visible on the polished surface. Immediately, he repeated. That word carried a strange mixture of relief and fear, because a transplant always means two stories crossing at the same moment. One family gaining hope, another family facing unimaginable loss. Nicole understood that. He had spent enough time in hospitals to know that miracles rarely arrive alone. The doctor continued reading the data on the screen. Then he paused. Something about the information caught his attention. Nicole noticed the hesitation. What is it? The doctor looked up again. There's something unusual about this donor case. Nicole's chest tightened slightly. Unusual how? The doctor turned the tablet so Nicole could see part of the information. The donor was admitted through the emergency department earlier tonight. Nicole stared at the screen. So the donor was already here in the hospital? Yes. Nicole frowned slightly. That seems fast. It is. The doctor nodded. The family made a decision quickly after it became clear the patient would not recover. Nicole's voice dropped lower. What happened? The doctor spoke carefully. Severe cardiac failure. Nicole swallowed slowly, because those words were painfully familiar. Another heart, another fight that didn't end the way anyone hoped. The doctor continued. The patient arrived earlier tonight with a family member. Nicole's eyes lifted. A family member? Yes. The doctor scrolled further through the notes. Then he paused again. Nicole leaned forward slightly. What is it? The doctor read the line again. Nicole blinked. What nurse? The doctor glanced at the name listed in the notes. Then he looked up again. Tiffany. Nicole felt the room shift slightly. Tiffany? Yes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nicole's mind moved quickly. Earlier tonight, emergency department, a desperate family, a failing heart, and Tiffany, working a long shift, trying to help someone who might not survive. He leaned back slowly. You're saying the donor, the doctor nodded, is the same patient Tiffany treated earlier tonight. The words landed heavily in the room. Nicole's mind returned suddenly to the story Tiffany had shared. The young man, his father, the fear in his voice. Please, you have to help him. Nicole closed his eyes briefly, because the timeline now made terrible sense. But the family had made a decision in the middle of their grief. A decision that would give someone else a chance. Nicole's voice came out quieter than before. The doctor nodded. Yes. Nicole exhaled slowly. For a moment, the weight of the moment settled over him. Two families connected by one decision, two stories crossing in the same hospital on the same night, and suddenly something else struck him, a detail he hadn't considered until now. He looked back at the doctor. When did that patient arrive? The doctor checked the chart again. Late evening. Nicole's mind moved through the timeline again. Late evening. Emergency room. Tiffany working, helping that family. And only a few hours later, she had stepped outside the hospital after her shift, tired, exhausted, looking for a ride home, and climbed into the wrong car. His car. Nicole leaned back slowly in his chair. The realization unfolded piece by piece. That night, the same night Tiffany accidentally entered his car, she had already been part of the story that might save his brother. Not intentionally, not knowingly. But her work, her compassion, her presence in that emergency room, had been part of the chain of events that brought the donor case into the hospital system. Nicole ran a hand slowly across his face. Life had a strange way of weaving people together. Sometimes the connections didn't reveal themselves until later. Much later. He looked back at the doctor. So if the tests confirm compatibility, the doctor nodded, then your brother will receive that heart. Nicole said nothing for a moment, because gratitude and grief were standing side by side in his chest. Gratitude for the chance his brother might receive. Grief for the family who had just lost someone they loved. Finally he spoke again. Tiffany should know. The doctor nodded slowly. Yes. Down the hallway, Tiffany still stood near room 418, watching the movement around the transplant floor. Her thoughts had returned, again to the young man she had met earlier. His father, his desperation, his voice shaking, and now the nurse's words echoed again in her mind. The donor case came from the emergency unit earlier tonight. Tiffany exhaled slowly, because sometimes the connections between moments only become visible later. Much later. And sometimes, the kindness someone shows in one room becomes the reason hope arrives in another. Hospitals have a different kind of silence during surgery nights. Not the peaceful kind, not the empty kind. A waiting silence, the kind where every clock tick sounds louder than it should, where every set of footsteps in the hallway makes someone lift their head, hoping the next moment will bring news. Inside the transplant wing of Cone Health, Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital, that silence had settled like a blanket over the floor. Nicole sat alone in the waiting area just outside the surgical unit. The chair beneath him was stiff, the lighting soft, the hallway nearly empty, but his mind felt louder than everything around him, because somewhere behind those closed operating room doors, a team of surgeons was carefully working through one of the most delicate procedures medicine could attempt. A heart transplant. His brother's life now rested in the hands of people he had never met before tonight. Nicole leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. Waiting does something strange to time. Minutes stretch, seconds repeat. Thoughts circle endlessly. Across the hallway, a clock quietly marked the passing of each moment. Nicole had already watched the second hand complete dozens of rotations. Each one felt longer than the last. Footsteps approached softly. Nicole looked up. Tiffany walked into the waiting area holding 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him. You're going to wear a hole in the floor if you keep pacing like that, she said gently. Nicole gave a tired half smile. I didn't even realize I was pacing. You were... He accepted the coffee. Thank you. They sat quietly for a moment. Neither one spoke. Sometimes the best support didn't require conversation, just presence. Nicole finally broke the silence. I keep thinking about that family. Tiffany nodded. The donor family, yes. Nicole stared at the floor for a moment. They lost someone tonight. Tiffany's voice softened. And because of their decision, your brother has a chance. Nicole exhaled slowly. That kind of generosity in the middle of grief. He shook his head. I don't know if I could do that. Tiffany thought about the young man she had met earlier that evening, the fear in his voice, the love he clearly carried for his father, then the unimaginable decision that must have followed. You'd be surprised what people find strength to do when they're facing loss, she said quietly. Nicole nodded. He understood that now more than he ever had before. They sat together again in silence. Minutes passed. Then another set of footsteps echoed down the hallway. A nurse moved quickly past them, pushing open a set of doors near the surgical wing. The doors closed again. Nicole glanced at the clock. 3 hours. That's normal for this kind of surgery, Tiffany replied. I know, but knowing didn't make the waiting easier. Nicole leaned back against the chair. Do you ever get used to this part? Tiffany shook her head slowly. No. What part? The moment where everything depends on something happening behind a closed door. Nicole looked toward the operating wing again. The doors remained still, silent. Behind them, surgeons moved with careful precision, hands steady, every movement deliberate. Because a heart transplant is more than a procedure. It's a race against time. The failing heart must be removed, the donor heart prepared, every artery connected with careful accuracy. And through it all, the clock keeps moving. Nicole's thoughts drifted, again, to childhood memories, to laughter, to the sound of his brother teasing him about working too much. He closed his eyes briefly. Stay strong, he murmured quietly. Tiffany heard it, because some words are meant for the person lying in the operating room, even if they can't hear them. More time passed. 4 hours, then 5. The waiting area grew even quieter. Nicole's coffee had long since gone cold. Tiffany stood near the window now, watching the faint lights of Greensboro glowing in the distance. Hospitals never truly sleep, but the world outside always keeps moving. Cars passed quietly along the distant road. A faint breeze moved the trees near the parking lot. Nicole suddenly stood up. I can't sit anymore. Tiffany turned toward him. That's normal. He paced slowly across the waiting area, back and forth, back and forth. The same path he had walked all night. Then, the surgical doors opened. Nicole froze. A doctor stepped out, mask lowered, surgical cap still in place. Nicole's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped forward. Doctor? The doctor walked toward him. For a moment the doctor said nothing. Those few seconds felt endless. Nicole braced himself for either answer. Hope or heartbreak. The transplant is complete. Nicole's breath caught. And? The doctor allowed the smallest smile to appear. The surgery was successful. The words hung in the air. Nicole felt his knees weaken slightly. He reached for the back of a chair to steady himself. Successful. His brother had a chance. Tiffany let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The doctor continued. The new heart is responding well so far. The next 20 to 4 hours will still be critical. But the procedure itself went exactly as planned. Nicole closed his eyes for a moment. Relief flooded through him. Not loud, not dramatic, just a deep wave of gratitude washing over every exhausted part of his body. When he opened his eyes again, Tiffany was standing beside him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Looks like your brother got his miracle. Nicole nodded slowly, but his thoughts returned, again to the other family. The one who had made the impossible decision that allowed this moment to happen, because every miracle inside a hospital has two sides, hope and loss. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on Nicole's shoulder. You can see him once he's moved to recovery. Nicole nodded. Thank you for everything. The doctor gave a tired but satisfied smile before returning through the surgical doors. The hallway fell quiet again. Nicole looked down at the floor for a moment. Then he glanced at Tiffany. You know something? What? If you hadn't stepped into the wrong car that night. He paused. We might never have met. Tiffany smiled gently. And if we hadn't met, Nicole finished the thought quietly, I might never have realized how many lives connect inside a place like this. She nodded slowly. Because sometimes life reveals its meaning through moments we never planned. And sometimes, the smallest mistakes lead us exactly where we were meant to be. Nicole looked down the quiet hallway once more. Then he asked a question softly, almost to himself. What if the moments we think are accidents, he paused, are really directions? And maybe that's the question the story leaves behind. When life places someone unexpected in your path, do you dismiss the moment and walk away? Or do you stay long enough to discover that the wrong turn might actually be leading you toward the right story? 3 days after the surgery, the hospital felt different. Not quieter. Hospitals are never truly quiet. But the tension that had wrapped itself around room 418 during those long nights had begun to loosen. Just a little. Recovery carries its own rhythm. Slower, gentler, careful steps forward instead of desperate leaps. Nicole stood near the doorway of the recovery unit, watching through the glass panel for a moment before stepping inside. His brother lay in the bed, pale but stable. The new heart, still adjusting to its unfamiliar home, worked steadily beneath the quiet rise and fall of the hospital blanket. Machines still surrounded the bed, monitors, 4 lines, careful reminders that healing is rarely simple. But the rhythm on the screen looked stronger now, more confident. Nicole let out a slow breath as he walked toward the chair beside the bed. He had learned something over the past few days. Miracles inside hospitals rarely arrive in loud celebrations. They arrive quietly, a slightly stronger heartbeat, a better lab result, a doctor saying, "He's improving." Nicole sat down. For a moment he simply watched. The steady movement of the monitor, the gentle motion of his brother's breathing. It still felt unreal. 3 nights earlier, the future had felt uncertain. Fragile. Now there was something else inside the room. Possibility. The door opened softly behind him. Nicole turned. Tiffany stepped inside holding a small clipboard. Her hair was tied back again, her scrubs crisp, her expression calm the way nurses learn to carry themselves even during emotional moments. "You're early again," she said. Nicole smiled faintly. "I'm starting to think this hospital chair belongs to me now." Tiffany glanced at the monitor. The numbers held steady. She nodded approvingly. "That heart is settling in nicely." Nicole leaned back slightly. "I still can't believe it." "Believe it," she said softly. Nicole watched her work for a moment. Over the past few days he had seen a different side of her. Not just the warm humor she carried in conversation, but the precision, the focus, the quiet authority that came with experience. Patients trusted her. Doctors respected her. Nicole spoke again after a moment. "You've been checking on him even when you're not assigned here." Tiffany shrugged lightly. "Old habits." Nicole studied her. "You care about people more than most professionals I've met." Tiffany paused. Then she leaned slightly against the counter beside the bed. "That's not really a professional skill," she said. "It's just something I grew up with." Nicole nodded slowly. "Your neighborhood. And my grandmother." Nicole smiled. "I should probably thank her one day." Tiffany laughed quietly. "She'd probably tell you to stop thanking people and start helping somebody." Nicole tilted his head. "That sounds like advice." It always was. They both glanced at the patient. Nicole's brother shifted slightly in his sleep. The movement was small, but Nicole noticed it instantly. He moved. Tiffany smiled. "That's a good sign." Nicole exhaled slowly. The tension he had carried in his shoulders for days softened just a little more. Then he looked back at Tiffany. "You know something strange?" "What?" "A week ago my world looked completely different." "How so?" Nicole leaned forward slightly. "My schedule was filled with meetings, contracts, deadlines, and now I spend my days sitting in a hospital room watching someone breathe." Tiffany nodded. "Funny how life rearranges priorities." Nicole laughed quietly. "That's one way to describe it." They stood quietly for a moment. "I've been thinking about that diner." Tiffany raised an eyebrow. "The food or the people?" "The people. What about them?" Nicole leaned against the chair. "They greeted you like family." "That's because most of them have known me for years." "That's not what I mean." Tiffany looked curious. "They trust you," Nicole said. "They know you care." Tiffany thought about that. "That's just community." Nicole shook his head gently. "It's more than that." He paused. "In the business world, people respect success. In your world, people respect kindness." Tiffany smiled softly. "My grandmother would like that sentence." Nicole nodded. "I'm starting to understand why." The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of fear anymore. This was a softer kind of quiet, the quiet that comes when people realize something important about life. Nicole glanced toward the hallway. "I've been walking around this hospital a lot the past few days." "Observing?" "Yes. And what did you see?" Nicole leaned forward slightly. "I saw families sitting in waiting rooms, people holding hands, people praying." Tiffany listened. "And I realized something." "What?" Nicole looked at her carefully. "Hospitals are where the real parts of life show up." Tiffany nodded slowly. "That's true," Nicole continued. "No money, no status, no business titles. Just people, hoping someone they love gets another chance." Tiffany studied him for a moment. "You're seeing the world differently now." Nicole nodded. "Yes." He looked again at his brother. "Because sometimes it takes standing at the edge of losing someone." He paused to understand what really matters. Tiffany didn't respond right away. She simply glanced once more at the steady rhythm on the monitor. Then she spoke softly. "That heart beating right there." Nicole looked up. "It's more than a medical success," she said. Nicole nodded slowly. "Yes, it's a reminder. Of what? Tiffany smiled gently. That life sometimes gives us second chances. She paused for a moment, not just to survive, but to live differently. Recovery has a quiet kind of progress. It rarely arrives with dramatic announcements. Most of the time, it shows up in small moments, a patient sitting up for the first time, a few steps taken down a hallway, a doctor nodding slightly while reviewing a chart. 2 weeks after the transplant, those small moments had begun to add up inside room 418. Nicole stood near the window while his brother slowly practiced breathing exercises with a therapist. In, hold, out. The rhythm looked simple, but everyone in the room understood how meaningful that progress was. Nicole watched closely. Every improvement felt like a gift. Every steady heartbeat felt like something that could never be taken for granted again. The therapist finished the session and gave an encouraging nod before leaving the room. Nicole's brother leaned back against the pillows, tired but smiling faintly. Nicole stepped closer to the bed. You're getting stronger. A weak chuckle answered him. Feels like I ran a marathon just breathing. Nicole smiled. Well, you kind of did. They both laughed quietly. Moments like that had become more common over the past several days. The fear that once filled the room had slowly been replaced by something else. Relief, gratitude, and a strange new awareness about how fragile life could be. A soft knock sounded at the door. Tiffany stepped inside. Her presence still carried the same calm energy she had brought into the room from the very beginning. Look at you, she said warmly. Progress. Nicole's brother lifted a hand weakly. Trying, Tiffany checked the chart at the end of the bed. The numbers looked good. Steady, strong, exactly the kind of progress transplant teams hope to see. You'll be walking the hallway before long, she said. Nicole's brother raised an eyebrow. That sounds ambitious. Tiffany smiled. Recovery always is. She finished updating the chart and turned toward Nicole. You have a minute? Nicole nodded. They stepped into the hallway together. The corridor felt brighter than it had weeks earlier, or maybe the change was inside them. Nicole leaned lightly against the wall. What's up? Tiffany crossed her arms casually. You've been making a lot of phone calls lately. Nicole chuckled. Hospital walls are thin. I noticed. He looked slightly sheepish. I guess old habits come back eventually. Tiffany studied him carefully. But these calls sound different. Nicole paused for a moment. Then he nodded. They are. He walked a few steps down the hallway before continuing. You know what I kept thinking about after the surgery? Tiffany followed beside him. What? That donor family. Tiffany nodded slowly. That moment changed a lot of people. Nicole stopped near the large window overlooking the parking lot. The father who passed away. He paused. His decision saved my brother. Tiffany listened quietly. Nicole continued. But it also made me realize something else. What's that? Nicole turned toward her. There are probably thousands of families in hospitals like this every year. People waiting for help, waiting for care they might not be able to afford. Tiffany nodded slowly. That happens more than most people realize. Nicole's voice grew thoughtful. I've spent years funding big projects, corporate initiatives, buildings, but sitting in that waiting room, he shook his head slightly. I realize the people who need help the most often get the least attention. Tiffany said nothing, because she had seen that truth many times during long shifts. Nicole continued. So I started making some calls. Tiffany raised an eyebrow. What kind of calls? Nicole leaned back against the window ledge. The kind that start new programs. Tiffany waited. Nicole spoke carefully. I'm setting up a foundation branch focused on transplant support. Her eyes widened slightly. What kind of support? Financial assistance, transportation, housing for families waiting through long surgeries. Tiffany blinked. That's huge. Nicole nodded. And there's something else. What? He smiled slightly. It's going to focus heavily on underserved communities. Tiffany studied him for a moment. You mean neighborhoods like the one you visited with me? Nicole nodded again. Yes. Tiffany leaned against the wall quietly. For a moment she didn't speak. Nicole noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. What? She shook her head slowly. It's just strange. How so? You're making decisions that could change a lot of lives. She paused. Nicole smiled gently. That night changed me more than you realize. Tiffany looked up. Really? Nicole nodded. Before all this, I believed success meant building things. Companies, investments, structures. He looked down the hallway where nurses moved quietly between patient rooms. But you showed me something else. Tiffany tilted her head slightly. What's that? Nicole met her eyes. That the most important work sometimes happens quietly, in rooms like these, between people who simply care about each other. Tiffany felt a small warmth settle in her chest, because sometimes influence doesn't arrive through speeches or announcements. Sometimes it happens through simple conversations. Nicole added softly. I thought I was the one giving you a ride that night. Tiffany smiled. You were? Nicole shook his head slightly. No. His voice softened. Tiffany laughed gently. My grandmother would say that sounds about right. Nicole chuckled. What did she always say again? Tiffany's voice carried that familiar warmth. That life has a funny way of placing people exactly where they're meant to be. Nicole nodded slowly. And sometimes, he glanced down the hallway again, those moments don't just change one life, they change many. Spring arrived quietly in Greensboro, not with dramatic announcements or sudden warmth, but with small signs that life was moving forward again. Trees along the sidewalks slowly filled with new leaves. Front porches began to see people sitting outside again in the evenings. Children rode bicycles through neighborhood streets while the air carried the faint scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. A few months had passed since the long nights inside Cone Health Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital, and a lot had changed. Nicole walked slowly along a paved path in one of Greensboro's small neighborhood parks. The afternoon sun rested gently over the open green space. Nearby, a group of kids laughed loudly as they chased each other across the grass. A man walked his dog along the far end of the path. Life, simple life, continued all around. Nicole reached the park bench near the large oak tree, and there she was. Tiffany sat at the far end of the bench, holding a cup of coffee and watching the park with the same quiet calm she carried everywhere she went. She looked up as he approached. You're late, Nicole smiled. I brought proof that I was productive. He held up a folder. Tiffany raised an eyebrow. That's suspicious. Nicole sat down beside her. For what? Nicole opened the folder and handed her the first page. Tiffany glanced down. Her eyes moved slowly across the document. Then she looked up. You actually did it. Nicole nodded. The transplant support program officially launches next month. Tiffany studied the document again. Funding allocations, community outreach, patient housing support, transportation assistance. Resources focused on families who normally struggle to access specialized care. She looked at him carefully. This is going to help a lot of people. That's the plan. Tiffany leaned back against the bench. You really changed your priorities. Nicole smiled slightly. I think life changed them for me. A light breeze moved gently through the trees above them. For a moment they both watched the park quietly. A little boy nearby struggled to fly a kite while his father tried patiently to help him. The kite finally lifted slightly into the air. The boy shouted with excitement. Nicole chuckled softly. You know something? What? I keep thinking about that night. Tiffany tilted her head. The hospital? No. He smiled. The car. Tiffany laughed. Oh, Lord, not this again. Nicole nodded. That moment when you opened the door and climbed into the wrong car. Tiffany shook her head. I was exhausted. You still did it. She smiled mischievously. Well, technically your driver opened the door. Nicole laughed. That's a fair point. They both fell into comfortable silence again. Then Tiffany spoke quietly. You know my grandmother had another saying. Nicole looked curious. I'm starting to think she had a saying for everything. She did. What was this one? Tiffany watched the kite finally lift higher into the sky. Then she spoke softly. She used to say mistakes are sometimes just directions in disguise. Nicole nodded slowly. That sounds familiar. Because you lived it. Nicole leaned back slightly on the bench. You stepped into the wrong car and somehow ended up in the right story. Tiffany smiled gently. Nicole chuckled. From my perspective, it was pretty entertaining. She nudged his arm lightly. Don't get used to that. Nicole laughed again. But after a moment, his expression turned thoughtful. You know something else? What? If that moment hadn't happened... He paused. I might never have seen the world the way you see it. Tiffany studied him quietly. And how do I see it? Nicole gestured toward the park. Like every person matters, like kindness is normal. Tiffany smiled softly. That's just how I was raised. Nicole nodded. And now it's shaping how I live. They both watched the kite climb higher into the afternoon sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Some stories don't end with dramatic declarations. Some end with quiet understanding. Two people realizing that a simple mistake, a wrong turn, a moment of curiosity, can lead somewhere meaningful. Nicole finally spoke again. You ever wonder how many moments like that people miss? Tiffany tilted her head. What do you mean? She thought about that. Then she smiled. My grandmother would say people usually realize those moments later. Nicole chuckled. That sounds about right. They sat together for a long moment beneath the shade of the oak tree. The park continued around them, children laughing, wind moving through the leaves, the soft hum of ordinary life. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside this story. Because sometimes the biggest changes in life begin with something small. A tired nurse finishing a long shift, a door opening, a wrong car, a simple conversation between strangers, moments that look accidental at first, but later, they start to look a lot like destiny. So let me leave you with one final question. If life placed someone unexpected in your path tonight, would you recognize the moment or walk past the story meant for you? And if this story reminded you that the smallest moments can carry the biggest meaning, take a second to support the channel. Like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to Mr. Dave Stories, where every story reminds us that life's unexpected moments often lead us exactly where we need to be.